conference room on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over downtown Chicago, and I remember thinking, the morning everything changed, that the city looked almost unbearably beautiful from up there. Steel and glass catching the early light. Lake Michigan, a flat silver ribbon at the edge of the skyline. I had stood at those windows 100 times over 6 years, coffee in hand, running through presentations in my head. But that morning I wasn't holding coffee. I was standing at the far end of the table, completely alone, watching my stepfather laugh. He didn't even try to hide it. He leaned back in his chair at the head of the table. His chair, always his chair, even though the nameplate on the door still said Harwell Architecture Group, the name my grandfather had painted there in 1974. And he laughed the way men laugh when they've already won and they want you to know it. Slow, comfortable, like he had all the time in the world. "You really thought you had something," he said. "That's almost impressive." My half-brother was sitting to his left. He was looking at his phone. I didn't say anything. I had learned by then that saying anything only gave them more to use. I should tell you how I got there, because none of it makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning goes back further than most people would think. My name is Nora. I'm 31 years old, and for the first 24 years of my life, I believed that family meant something. My grandfather built Harwell Architecture Group from nothing. A drafting table in a rented room in Lincoln Park, one city contract for a public library renovation, and enough stubbornness to outlast every competitor who told him the market was saturated. By the time I was born, the firm had designed 3 hospitals, a federal courthouse, and more commercial towers than I ever bothered to count. My mother grew up in that firm. She used to say she learned to walk by pulling herself up on drafting table legs. My father died when I was 4. Car accident on I-90 Black Ice, February. I barely remember him, which is its own particular grief. Not the sharp grief of loss, but the dull ache of an absence you can't even properly name. My mother remarried when I was 9. His name was Roland. He was a developer, charming in the way that men who've spent decades selling things to people become charming, reflexively, without effort, without it meaning anything at all. My grandfather didn't trust Roland from the beginning. He never said so directly, but I was a perceptive kid, and I watched the way my grandfather's jaw tightened whenever Roland started talking about synergies and vertical integration and what Harwell could become with the right capital infusion. My grandfather was an architect. He cared about buildings. He cared about the spaces people moved through and how those spaces made them feel. He did not care even slightly about capital infusion. He died when I was 19. Heart attack in his office at his desk, which is exactly how he would have chosen to go if anyone had asked him. He left the firm to my mother with the explicit instruction that if she ever sold it, the sale price was to be split equally among his 4 grandchildren. I was one of them. My half-brother Preston, Roland's son from his first marriage, 3 years older than me, was not. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it because I was 19 and I thought noticing was enough. It wasn't. I studied architecture at the University of Illinois, graduated top of my class, which I'm not saying to brag, I'm saying it because it matters to what came later, and because for a long time nobody in my own family acknowledged it. I came back to Chicago and joined Harwell at 23. Junior associate. I didn't expect special treatment. I wanted to earn it the way my grandfather had earned everything he built. What I didn't expect was how thoroughly Preston had already consolidated his position. In the 3 years I'd been at school, Roland had gradually taken on more administrative responsibility at the firm, ostensibly to help my mother, who'd been dealing with health issues. Preston had come in as a senior associate, then project director, then somehow head of business development, a title that hadn't existed before Roland invented it. The org chart, by the time I arrived, already had them at the center of everything. My mother was still president in name, but it was Roland's firm in practice. I told myself it didn't matter. I had skills. I would prove myself. I worked 80-hour weeks. I redesigned the firm's entire sustainable materials procurement process in my first year and saved us $340,000 in annual costs. I brought in a mid-sized hospital contract in my second year entirely on my own. Cold calls, site visits, 3 presentations before they said yes. I was good at the work. I loved the work. Roland and Preston were polite to me in the way that people are polite to someone they have already decided is not a threat. My mother. I want to be careful about my mother, because the truth is complicated and she is still my mother. She was not a bad person. She was a woman who had spent decades believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as preserving love, and those are not the same thing, and eventually that confusion cost her everything. She saw what was happening. I believe she saw it, but she had also convinced herself that Roland would take care of things, that family would sort itself out, that it would all be fine. She told me this so many times in so many different ways that I think she was mostly trying to convince herself. It will all be fine. It was not fine. The first sign that things were actively wrong rather than just quietly uncomfortable came on a Tuesday in March, about 2 years before the conference room scene I started with. Preston came to my office and closed the door, which he never did, and sat down across from my desk with an expression I couldn't read. He told me there was a financial discrepancy in the Henderson contract accounts. He told me the auditors had flagged it. He told me, his voice very even and careful, that my name was on several of the relevant purchase orders. I stared at him. What are you talking about? About $180,000 in materials charges that don't match any deliveries, he said. Your authorization codes. I had never felt fear quite like that before. Not the sharp adrenaline fear of physical danger, but something slower and colder. A fear that settles into your chest and just stays there. Because I knew immediately that I had not authorized anything of the sort. But I also knew that authorization codes can be replicated, that I had been the lead architect on the Henderson project, that if someone had wanted to attach something to my name, the Henderson project would have been the obvious place to do it. That's not possible, I said. Preston looked at me for a long moment. I know this is hard to hear, but the firm can't have this kind of exposure. Roland thinks, we think, the cleanest resolution is for you to step back from your current projects, quietly, and we can handle the audit internally without it becoming a legal matter. Step back, quietly, meaning, resign, and don't make noise about it. You're asking me to cover for someone else's theft, I said. He stood up. I'm trying to help you. He was not trying to help me. He had never, not once in 6 years, been trying to help me. I didn't resign. I'm telling you that now because I want you to know that I didn't just roll over. I hired an attorney, a sharp, exhausting, expensive woman named Rachel, who wore the same 3 blazers in rotation and billed in 6-minute increments, and was absolutely worth every penny. And we spent 2 months building a paper trail showing that the purchase orders in question had been submitted from a computer terminal that was not mine during hours when batch records showed me in client meetings off-site. The authorization codes had been copied from a legitimate invoice I processed 6 months earlier. It was, as Rachel said with professional understatement, not a subtle frame. But here is the thing about being right. Being right is not the same as winning. Roland had spent 3 years making himself indispensable to the firm's banking relationships, its insurance carriers, its largest clients. When he and Preston called a partners meeting and presented their version of events, sanitized, strategic, with me cast as a liability to be managed, most of the room believed them. Or they believed them enough. Or they didn't want to find out what it would cost to believe me. My mother sat at that table and said nothing. I looked at her across the room, and she looked at the surface of the table, and she said nothing. I was 28 years old, sitting in my grandfather's firm, in a building my grandfather had designed, watching the people who were supposed to love me choose convenience over truth, and I made myself a promise. Not a dramatic promise, not a revenge fantasy, just a quiet, specific, absolute promise to myself that I would not let this be the end of my story. I cleared my desk that afternoon. I took the framed photo of my grandfather and me at my college graduation. I took the small set of drafting pencils he had given me when I got my acceptance letter. I left everything else. For the first 3 months I lived in a studio apartment in Pilsen that cost $950 a month and had a radiator that clanged all night and a view of a parking structure. I did freelance drafting work for a small residential firm to cover my bills. I ate a lot of rice and beans and told myself I was making choices, not suffering consequences. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one. But I was also working. Every evening, after the freelance hours, I was working on something else. I had spent 6 years at Harwell watching how mid-sized firms won contracts, which relationships mattered, where the decision-making actually happened versus where it appeared to happen. I had a specific insight that I'd been sitting on for 2 years, something I noticed while managing the Henderson project. There was a gap in the market for architecture firms that specialized in adaptive reuse of distressed commercial properties, converting dead retail spaces and underutilized office buildings into mixed-use residential. Post-pandemic, there was a surplus of exactly those properties in every mid-sized American city. Most established firms didn't want to touch them because the margins were complicated and the regulatory landscape was a headache. I found the complexity interesting. I found most things interesting that other people found difficult. I put together a business plan that I revised 11 times. I applied for a small business administration loan and got $175,000, which was not enough but was a start. I found a partner, a structural engineer named Beth, who I'd worked with on a hospital project and who had her own reasons for wanting to be her own boss. And we rented a tiny office in the West Loop above a dry cleaner, with exposed brick and radiators that also clanged, but these ones felt earned. We called the firm Sable Studio. We did not advertise. We did not make noise. I was very deliberate about staying quiet, about building in a direction where Harwell wouldn't notice us until we were large enough that their noticing wouldn't matter. It took 2 years, 2 years of 18-hour days and missed holidays, and one particularly low Tuesday in November when I sat on the floor of that West Loop office at 11 at night wondering if I was a fool. Beth knocked and came in and sat on the floor next to me without saying anything for a while and then said, "We have a meeting with the Detroit Housing Authority at 9 tomorrow morning." And I said, "I know," and we both got back up. The direct contract was $4.2 million, and it led directly to 3 more. By the time I was 30, Sable Studio had 12 employees and a client list that made people do a small double take when they saw it. I had been careful about press minimal, strategic, but within the professional community, the firm had a reputation. We were good and we were unusual, and we solved problems that other firms turned away from. More importantly, I had done something else during those 2 years that I had told exactly one person about. That person was my attorney Rachel, and I had told her because I needed legal guidance, not because I wanted anyone else to know. I had been quietly buying Harwell debt. Here is the thing about architecture firms that expand aggressively without sufficient capital reserves. They take on project financing from private lenders, and when the project timelines slip, that debt becomes a problem. Roland had spent a year since my grandfather's death expanding Harwell's footprint. New offices in Dallas and Miami, a pivot into high-end hospitality design, and he had financed that expansion with short-term debt instruments that assumed a level of revenue growth the firm wasn't actually achieving. By the time I had been gone 2 years, Harwell was carrying approximately $6.8 million in debt across 4 private lenders. I bought 3 of those debt positions, not in my own name, through a holding company called Meridian Capital Advisors, which Rachel's firm had set up and which had no visible connection to me. To Roland and Preston, Meridian was simply one of several institutional creditors who had acquired their paper in the secondary market. They had sent the standard courtesy notices. They had not been alarmed. I was very good at not alarming people who should have been alarmed. The 4th debt position I didn't need to buy. I just needed to wait. What happened with my mother happened in October. She called me one evening, which she rarely did. Our relationship by then was civil and distant, the temperature of an obligation rather than a choice. But that night she sounded frightened, which was different. She told me that Roland had been talking about selling a portion of the firm's equity to a private investor. She told me she wasn't sure about the terms. She told me she didn't know who the investor was. I told her I loved her and that I would look into it. I knew who the investor was because the investor was me. Or rather, it was Meridian, making what appeared to be an opportunistic equity acquisition from an architecture firm that needed liquidity. Roland had agreed to the terms without apparent need, doing the level of due diligence that a more careful man would have done. Rachel had structured the agreement with a provision I will admit I was particularly pleased with, a covenant giving Meridian the right to call all 3 debt positions immediately if the equity purchase triggered any change in firm governance, without Meridian's prior written consent. It was, as Rachel said, not a standard provision. Most people wouldn't think to ask for it. I had thought to ask for it. The morning of the 42nd floor, the morning I started with, happened because Preston made a mistake. He found out, somehow, that there was a connection between Meridian and a former Harwell employee. His information was incomplete and 6 weeks out of date, but it was enough to spook him. He called a partners' meeting, did not invite me, and moved to formally amend the firm's ownership structure to dilute the equity position Meridian held. That triggered the covenant. Rachel filed the notice of acceleration at 8:15 in the morning. At 8:45, I walked into the Harwell Group offices for the first time in 3 years and asked the receptionist, a young woman named Kelly who had started after I left and who looked at me with politely confused eyes, if I could use the conference room. I want to be honest about what I felt walking through those offices. I had expected to feel triumphant or cold or some cinematic version of vindicated. What I actually felt was tired, not the tired of defeat, just tired, the way you feel after a very long journey when you can finally see where you're going and you realize the journey has taken more out of you than you let yourself acknowledge while you were in the middle of it. I sat in the conference room and waited. Roland came in first with Preston behind him, and they both stopped when they saw me. Roland's face did a series of things in quick succession. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been the beginning of fear, and then the practiced smoothness of a man who has talked his way out of things before and believes he can do it again. Nora, he said like I was a pleasant surprise. Good morning, I said. Preston looked at his phone, old habit, and then looked at me with an expression that I found interesting. Not quite fear, something more specific. The expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the ground he's been standing on is not solid. I slipped the document package across the table. Meridian has accelerated all 3 debt positions. They're due in full within 90 days. Additionally, the equity covenant has been triggered, which means the governance amendment you filed this morning is void, and Meridian's board consent is now required for any operational decisions above $50,000. Roland picked up the documents. Put them down. Pick them up again. Who is Meridian? I am, I said. The silence in that room was very complete. Through the windows, Chicago glittered in the October light. I thought about my grandfather standing at a drafting table in Lincoln Park. I thought about my mother saying it will all be fine. That's Roland started. Legal, I said. Completely and thoroughly legal. Rachel has prepared a summary for your attorneys if they'd like to review it. Preston said nothing. He was still looking at his phone, but I don't think he was seeing what was on it. You can't run this firm, Roland said. His voice had changed. The smoothness was still there, but something underneath it had gone tight. I don't want to run this firm, I said, and that was the truth. I want to sell it. Per the terms of my grandfather's estate, the sale proceeds will be distributed equally among his 4 grandchildren. That's been the standing instruction since he died, and it's about 12 years overdue. I stood up. Roland was gripping the edge of the table, not dramatically, just a small, controlled grip, the kind of tension that works its way into your hands when you're trying to stay composed and you're not entirely succeeding. You did all of this, he said, for money. No, I said. I did all of this because he built something worth protecting, and for 12 years the wrong people protected it. I should tell you what happened after, because endings matter and I don't believe in stopping before the hard parts. The sale took 7 months to complete. A regional firm based in Minneapolis made the acquisition. They were solid and unexciting, and had no interest in the hospitality pivot Roland had been pushing, which meant they also had no interest in Roland. He was not part of the transition team. He cleaned out his office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I was not there to see it, because I had decided it was not something I needed to see. Preston got his share of the sale proceeds, same as the rest of my grandfather's grandchildren. I want to be clear about that because people always assume revenge looks like deprivation. I wasn't interested in taking anything from him. I was interested in taking back what had been taken from me, and those are different things. My mother called me the week the sale closed. She called me at 7 in the morning, which meant she'd been awake for a while, probably sitting in her kitchen the way she does when something is weighing on her, with her coffee going cold. She said she needed to apologize. She said a lot of things, actually, that I could tell she'd been rehearsing, and that came out slightly differently than she'd planned. the way real apologies usually do. I listened to all of it. I should have believed you, she said finally. I knew what they were. I knew it, and I told myself it was better not to make things worse. And I made everything worse. Yes, I said, because it was true, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Can you forgive me? I thought about that for a moment. Not a dramatic pause, just actually thinking about it. I can forgive you, I said. That doesn't mean I've forgotten, and it doesn't mean things go back to how they were. But yes, I can forgive you, she cried. I let her. We have lunch now, once a month. It's cautious and a little formal, and we're both working on what it can be from here, which is honest in a way our relationship wasn't honest before. I would rather have the honest version, even if it's harder. Sable Studio won a GSA contract for adaptive reuse of a former federal office building in Milwaukee last spring. That's the largest contract we've ever held. Beth and I stood in the parking lot outside our West Loop office after we got the call, and she opened a bottle of champagne she had apparently been keeping in her car for 18 months in anticipation of something worth celebrating. And we drank it warm in February with no glasses, and it was one of the best moments of my life. My grandfather's drafting pencils are on my desk. I use them on paper sketches, the first rough passes at a thing before it goes into the modeling software. There's something about pencil on paper that software still hasn't replicated, some quality of thinking through the hand that I'm not willing to give up. He taught me that. He taught me a lot of things that I didn't understand until I was old enough to need them. I am 31 years old. I built something. It took longer than it should have, and it cost more than it should have, and it cost more than it should have, and I am still working through what I feel about the people who made it cost that much. That's the honest answer. That's the answer nobody tells you. Not that you triumph and feel complete, but that you keep going, and the going itself becomes something you're proud of, and gradually that's enough. It turns out to be enough. I've thought a lot about what the turning point actually was. People want it to be dramatic. The moment in the conference room, Roland's hands gripping the table edge, the silence after I said I am. And that was something, I won't pretend otherwise. But that wasn't the real turning point. The real turning point was a Tuesday night in a Westloop office when I sat on the floor and considered quitting and didn't. Nobody sees that moment. Nobody puts it in a story, but that's the one that mattered. There's something I want to say about what Roland did and what Preston did and what my mother failed to do, because I think people misunderstand what actually happened to me. They didn't just steal an opportunity. They built a version of events in which I was unstable, dishonest, a liability, and they repeated it until enough people believed it that the truth became almost irrelevant. That's what cruelty at that level actually looks like. It's not dramatic. It's administrative. It's patient. It works through paperwork and silence and carefully worded statements in rooms you're not allowed into. What I learned is that the only answer to that kind of slow erasure is slow building. You cannot fight it quickly. You cannot make noise and win. You have to decide, in some quiet and specific part of yourself, what you are actually building toward, and then you have to build it while everyone who hurt you has already moved on and stopped watching. Roland stopped watching me the day I cleared my desk. That was his real mistake. Not the fraud, not the frame. The assumption that I was finished. I think about my grandfather a lot when I think about all of this. He built something with his hands and his mind and his stubbornness, and he built it honestly, and it lasted 40 years. Roland didn't build anything. He positioned himself next to something that was already built and called it his. There's a difference between those two things that I understood intellectually as a kid, but only understood in my body after I spent 2 years building Sable from nothing. When it's yours. When you actually made it, fought for it, sat on the floor at 11 at night wondering if you were a fool and got back up anyway. It feels completely different from anything you inherited or maneuvered your way into. Roland will never know what that feels like. I think that's its own consequence, quieter than anything a courtroom could deliver. My mother asked me if I could forgive her, and I said yes, and I meant it, and I also meant what I said after, that forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and it isn't the same as returning to what was. I think we confuse those things because it's easier to collapse them into one word. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself, so the weight of it stops living in your chest. Forgetting would be foolish. And going back to what was would just be setting up the conditions for the same thing to happen again. None of those are the same choice. What I want anyone to take from this is something simpler than a lesson, because I'm skeptical of lessons that wrap up too neatly. I just want you to know that quiet, impatient, and honest can outlast loud and aggressive and convenient. Not always. Not on a schedule you get to choose, but more often than people think, especially once you stop needing the people who hurt you to acknowledge what they did. The day I stopped needing Roland to admit it was the day I started actually winning. Everything else was just paperwork. Beth and I drank warm champagne in a parking lot in February. My grandfather's pencils are on my desk. I'm 31 and I'm still going. That's the whole story.